What's up, Geeks and Gamers? It's Odin coming back with another video, and today we'll be talking about the box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Encanto in its second week of release dropping 53% and pretty much guaranteeing that the film will be yet another box office flop for Disney as a company. They have just not had any luck when it comes to pretty much any of the films they've released this year being able to make any return on their investments. And it all comes down to a couple of things. One, of course, which everyone always likes to throw out there, is pandemic. But the most important and the more real reason as to why this is the case is because of how much money Disney just throws away on these massive films and these massive budgets. And in the end, we see that they are not going to be able to get returns on those investments if the marketplace continues to be like this in the future, which based on the fact that we seem to have nonstop variants and nonstop closings and nonstop 2 weeks, basically this perpetual nonstop to slow the spread nonsense, does not seem likely that theaters will be back in any way, shape, or form to support these kinds of films from Disney. Now, I know that you might be thinking, well, hey, Disney's Spider-Man's coming out, right? Well, you're wrong there, because first off, it's Sony's Spider-Man film, of which Marvel, again a part of Disney of course, only gets about 25% of the cut of that specific film. And so even if that is the only bright spot that anyone can really point to when it comes to MCU or Marvel or Disney this year, it is very much it's not much of a victory at all, because they get such a low return on that investment, where they have had massive losses in pretty much every major release that they've had this year, with very few exceptions. And those exceptions were not all that stellar to make up for the hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars that they've lost since the pandemic actually began. Before going any further, though, please make sure that you smash that like button. It really does help a lot. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel with that bell notification turned on. That way you know every time a new video or live stream goes live on the channel. So as you can see, Encanto has come in at number one again this weekend, dropping 53%. Last weekend was Thanksgiving, but as you can see, the total gross of the film domestically has only made $57.9 million. That means that this film is on pace to probably not even get to the $100 million mark. And if it does, it will have a long, long way to go. It would essentially have to double the amount of money it's made so far domestically, which is possible. It does happen, but is not nearly as common. And based on the fact that this is seeing a lot of massive drop-offs, especially during the week, it is not likely going to bring in enough money to get to the break-even point, which for its pretty modest budget is roughly around $300 million or so. Ghostbusters Afterlife, on the other hand, is continuing to have pretty solid holdovers now in its third week of release, dropping another 57%. It's finally starting to leave some theaters. This film, however, made and has crossed now $100 million with $100.2.1 million coming in at number two. And there was actually certain reports coming out that many thought Ghostbusters Afterlife was actually going to end up beating Encanto. It seems like that is not the case, and of course, these numbers could update before the weekend is out, and obviously sometime on Monday there's always adjustments made to these numbers because these are estimates. These are normally pretty spot on. There's very few changes that ever happen between now and tomorrow, but it's still something that obviously could happen because it's within about 2 million or so. And the fact that Ghostbusters in its third week of release is that close to a Disney animated feature is, I think, worthy of talking about. You know, people like to always criticize comparing certain films to other films that are outside the pandemic time. Well, let's compare these two films right here, which are both geared towards younger audiences. And you would think that, especially with Encanto being actually geared towards even more so family audiences, the families aren't going out to go see this film in droves, and the Hispanic community, let alone that this is obviously being geared towards as well, also does not seem to be showing up for this film either. While Ghostbusters is not only getting families coming out to it, but it's also, of course, appealing to teenagers and older demographics who are fans of the franchise. It's almost as if you give people what they want. If you give people a product that they actually want to go out to support and see, that people actually will go out to support and see, which is why Ghostbusters Afterlife is on pace now to be able to reach its break-even point and also make some profit to boot, and why Encanto will likely never even get close to its break-even point. And it is also, of course, being released for free on Disney Plus during Christmas. And so it is not really looking good for them to get a return on that investment, just like it has not been good for most of the Disney releases this year. House of Gucci dropped 53% here, so this is also another film in its second week of release, which based on these numbers and how paltry it's doing internationally, is likely also going to be another financial flop for the likes of not just United Artists, but also the people involved with the project. Christmas with The Chosen has been a Fathom event, which has actually broken Fathom event records. So that is obviously a pretty cool feat nonetheless. At 1,700 screens, it made $4.1 million with a total gross of $9 million. So this is essentially an episode of the Chosen series, which I myself have actually not really dove into that much, but this was a Fathom event release special, and clearly a lot of faith communities have gone out to support this film, so much so that Fathom Events has actually even broken records. And so that, again, brings up I think one of the counterpoints that one can easily make to anytime everyone ever uses the excuse of pandemic for why a film isn't doing very well or why it's unfair. I look to examples like Christmas with The Chosen, which is breaking records even though it is pandemic times. I look to films like Venom 2, which made $10 million more than the first Venom film did in its opening weekend during pandemic times. And again, you might be able to try and explain certain aspects of that and bring up certain points, but those are still facts. Those are still data points. And even if they might be these rare signs of life, it does show that there are films and events that people are willing to go out to the theater to go see, and other films where they are not as wanting to go see. For instance, a film like Eternals, which has another 50% drop, which again is a pretty solid hold if you break things down at that level. But as you can see, it is still very much far behind where the other Marvel films have been this year. It likely will not be able to pass up a film like Black Widow's domestic release. It definitely won't get anywhere close to the 200 plus million of Shang-Chi. But it is, again, a sign that the MCU is in a lot of trouble. Because if you, again, try to bring up Spider-Man, that is Sony. Even though it is within the MCU, even though Disney does get about 25% of the box office, and you could argue, too, well, they also get a lot of the merchandising sales, too, because they made that deal. Okay. Doesn't mean, as again, that the film itself is going to bring them a lot of money. Spider-Man is a very popular character. Sony has done a relatively good job so far with this new iteration of Spider-Man. There's actually a lot of videos coming out with interviews of the cast confirming some of the villains and some of the people thought to be the villains, specifically Green Goblin. So I won't go into spoilers there if you really just want to go in completely blind to it all. But there are videos out there kind of showing who they have in mind for that and who is actually playing that role. There was some disagreement on a recent Friday Night Tights about that very issue, but it does, again, show us that that is a very different property because not only is it Sony, but also because of the fact that it's not completely a Disney MCU product either. Resident Evil in its second week dropped off 50% and is not looking very good. While Dune, though it does make $1.8 million, a 13% drop you would think is pretty strong. As you can see, it is essentially almost out of theaters. It just opened up in Australia, where it made only $3 million and likely will not make that much more. So this film, as I've been saying for a long time, is not going to be able to reach its break-even point, is likely going to be a financial loss for all of those involved. And even though because of the way that Warner Brothers and Legendary have kind of split this, kind of similar to the Disney-Sony decision, right, where Legendary put in 75% or so, Warner Brothers put in about 25%, it's hard to really see where the money is on it. It has been greenlit for a sequel, that is still going on, but the reason why it brings concern for me as someone who liked the movie of Dune, it does kind of bring the question of how much money are they actually going to put in to that film. All right, so going into a couple of films that I know a lot of y'all care about a lot. So Encanto, $116 million in 2 weeks. This is one of the worst Disney releases that we have seen in a long time. And you cannot just blame the pandemic for this, because we have seen films, even with budgets like Encanto, that have been able to reach the heights of being able to not just break even, but also make profit. This is showing us, I think, that people are not willing and not wanting to go see these kinds of films to the same degree anymore. When you force people to stay at home, you force people to rethink priorities in life, and it turns out that people with kids especially don't really think it's worth going to see these types of films that don't seem to add much of anything new to the table. If this was a property or if this was a film or a story that seemed compelling to go see and was marketed that way, maybe this number would be higher. But obviously, that is not the case. Ghostbusters Afterlife is now at $145 million worldwide. So again, very much a domestic stronghold here. Internationally, it has never really been known to be a good property, again, as far as Ghostbusters is concerned. But it is very much on the way to, after just a few weeks of being out, to be able to reach its break-even point. And we'll keep an eye on that in its week-to-week release. And also Christmas with The Chosen, as I said, $9 million domestically, breaking records there with Fathom events. However, we don't really have any knowledge of a budget, so I'm not really going to be able to track this as much as I am with the other films because this is an episode of a series, and we don't have the actual data on how much money that this actual episode cost. So going into some projections that we can now make for these films. So Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City with $24 million now internationally can now make somewhere between $34 and $41 million, or rather $34 and $48 million at the end of its run. With a budget of $40 million, its break even is $100 million, meaning the film is going to lose anywhere between $39 and $30 million. You then also have the second week of The House of Gucci, which is expected to lose anywhere between $54 and $31 million. So yet another Ridley Scott film expected to be another financial flop. We also have Encanto in its second weekend, which because of the amount of money that it cost to make the movie, and keep in mind that the budget is actually somewhere between $120 and $150, that has now been reported as well, meaning that the break even for this is somewhere between $300 and $375 or so million. So this film is going to be probably north of $100 million loss when everything is said and done. But based on the smaller budget that was reported, the first budget that was reported, $80 to $40 million loss expected for Disney, yet another massive financial failure for them. And I cannot say I'm all that surprised by it. Ghostbusters Afterlife, as you can see, $145 million worldwide, means that this film right now is at negative $25 million, and it's very likely going to pass up this by next weekend, which was the minimum, meaning that this was the least amount of money it was going to make, which was to lose $13 million, meaning that it's going to end up somewhere between $26 and $6 million by the end of its run. If it has $26 plus million, what it means is that it over doubled its first 2 weeks of release. And typically when it comes to movies in their first 2 weeks of release, you can look at that number and determine whether or not it's going to be a success or not, which is how I do the metrics here on ombreviews.com. If you want to dive further into this chart and other films, you can check me out over at ombreviews.com, and of course on my YouTube channel, OMB Reviews as well, where I'll go into other films in addition to this. But what are your thoughts? Are you surprised? I'm honestly not. That Encanto is yet another massive loss for Disney. Again, gonna lose north of, with especially the knowledge that they have reported now, coming I think from Variety, that the budget was actually closer to $150 million, that they're likely going to have another $100 million loss. And that's, again, I've lost count of how many films that they put out this year that have lost that amount of money. They have not found a lot of returns on their investments when it comes to the films that they have been putting out there. Even their most, quote, successful films like Shang-Chi were just barely over that break-even line, making somewhere between $30 and $40 million or so in its entirety. And again, that is much better than the other films that they've had that have been massive losses, but that's not enough to make up for anything, right? So right now, as of last update, $33.9 million in profit is what Shang-Chi actually did. When you compare that to the financial loss of things like Black Widow, like Eternals, like going back to the very beginning of the pandemic, you had other films as well that were also massive financial failures, being north of $100 million in a financial failure at that. Specifically Onward, right? Onward was one of the first films impacted when theaters started to shut down. That was around a $220 million loss. So you add this on top of the countless other losses that they have had this year, and it is just, again, not looking good for them going forward. And hopefully it means that Disney will actually start to make good stories that people actually want to go see. And also, I really hope that it means that they'll start spending less money, because they're clearly wasting the money on God knows what at this point. But let me know your thoughts about this and anything else I mentioned in the comment section below this video. Smash that like button. Doesn't mean a lot. You're all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.